Are we able to see how many people are here? Oh, yep. We
No,
are.
we're waiting for people to join.
Hi, welcome and thanks for attending today's webinar on transformational people practices amidst a workforce crisis. Today's presenters are Jonathan DeCarlo, CEO at C4 Consulting, and Jay Voigt, a senior consultant at C4 Consulting and the principal at Human Capital Management. I really want to thank both of you for taking time to present today. Before I turn it over to them to present, I have a few announcements. First, my name is Peter Thomas. I'm the Director of Quality Assurance at NAATP. This webinar today is part of a series that NAATP hosts. You can view past webinars on demand through our website, naatp.org, and check back there for future webinars. The session today is being recorded. We'll send out a link to the recording next week in a follow-up email. That email will also include confirmation of CE credits through NAATP, a link to the slides from today, and again, that recording. Related to today's webinar, Cure and Treatment Centers Research Institute is conducting a study examining the level of burnout in professionals who work with clients in the substance use field. It is looking at current COVID-19 pandemic experiences as they relate to work satisfaction and burnout. The survey is being distributed to substance use professionals from around the country. I'll include a link to that study in the chat. I also want to make an announcement that NAATP conducts a biannual salary survey. The results from that survey are going to be released in the next month, so please check our website and look out for an email notifying you that the report has been published and it's available. We'll do Q&A kind of broken up into a few sections. As you have questions, please type those in the Q&A panel. The session is broken into kind of 3 sections, and at the end of each section, we'll do a Q&A and kind of a conversation with Jonathan and Jay and try to get through as many questions as we can. With that, Jonathan, Jay, thank you again for taking time to present with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And we thank the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers for allowing this collaboration to take place and for everyone taking the time to join us. Welcome to Transformational People Practices Amidst a Workforce Crisis. I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator, Jay Voigt, with over 20 years of experience in behavioral health and a deep passion for developing teams and people. One of Jay's wonderful hobbies is 5 years of unsuccessful gold panning, trying to work towards his retirement.
Thank you so much for the warm intro, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I hope that you find today's webinar to be very useful and helpful in your endeavors. And as you can see from the slide, Jonathan DeCarlo, he's the CEO of C4 Consulting. And his claim to fame is that he likes to transcribe cello music, progressive metal guitar shredding. It's a sight to see.
So our session goals for today really are extremely clear, and many of you have reviewed those. But briefly, our first goal is for our participants to develop an understanding of how to apply the best human capital management practices in alcohol and other drug treatment settings. Our second goal is for participants to be able to identify key tactics and drivers of employee attraction and retention in the modern behavioral health treatment workplace. And our last goal is for participants to participate virtually through our question opportunities in discussing and evaluating case studies that we'll present on organizations that exemplify best human capital management practices. You'll notice throughout at the bottom of this slide, you'll see our little thumbs up and our blue transformational people practice highlight of several opportunities that we'll reference throughout. So this is our little tagline that we've placed at various slides with different opportunities to look at transformational people practices.
Again, thanks for joining us, everyone. So let's start off with, a little bit of kind of level setting, where we're at now, how we got here, there wasn't always a workforce crisis, but COVID, a lot of other things contributed to that. Next slide, Jonathan. So this is a two-part slide. So the first part, if we think about healthcare in general, right, looking at those 3 bullet points, these are some of the drivers of kind of our current climate. So there's a great Harvard Business Review article called The 5 R's of the Great Resignation. And retirement, yes, we know that happened. Relocation, we've seen a lot of folks do that. Reconsideration really is more along the lines of the role that work plays in someone's life. People are thinking differently about work. Reshuffling is more about switching industries, and the reluctance is more centered around fear of COVID. So that coupled with the growth of telehealth, telemedicine, and the shifting expectations that healthcare employees have of their providers kind of brought us to where we are. So specific to treatment organizations, we've seen a lot of therapists transition to self-employed virtual services. It's really easy to open up a therapy practice now. The Sonderminds of the world, are working with a lot of clinicians that might otherwise be working with us. In addiction treatment, we've seen people also migrate to other industries, transition to lower stress roles. I think the last driver that's specifically relevant to us is addiction treatment professionals. Just like everyone else have family needs at home, but they are more apt to step up and volunteer to do that. Go to the next slide, Jonathan. So Jonathan and I, when we were preparing for this webinar, we got to talking and thought it might be useful for us to share with you what we've been hearing. So we have the privilege of working with leadership teams across the country in different types of organizations, even across other industries. But what we're looking at now, shouldn't be a surprise to everyone. If number 1 wasn't an issue, you probably wouldn't be attending here. But specifically, licensed clinicians and nurses, biggest deficit that we're hearing about. Staff retention and development, right? Okay, that's not new. 3, we've seen that for years, but it seems to be magnified, right? Compassion fatigue. The work that we do, how intimate of a professional relationship we have with our clients. 4, we're looking at the landscape, increased, fentanyl use, reduced capacity, and then the DE&I issues. We're seeing that across all the industries, but particularly in the human services field. We have counselors, we have clinicians. They're pretty in tune with that kind of stuff. And employees across all industries, but also in addiction counseling, are being more vocal about how important DEI is. Jonathan, would you add anything to that?
I would say that some of the things that people come to us with their greatest concerns often are in the crisis stage of their solution generation. That, the ongoing issues that come forward are usually persistent issues within workforce development within organizations, but more and more with the Great Resignation, as Jay identified, we're seeing more organizations look for very specialty trained position roles, large classifications of clinicians, nurses, physicians, and behavioral health tech or case manager roles coming up. And the combination of these things is not anything new for folks who've been in the industry for, say, 15 to 20 years. We've seen this workforce shortage building over the last several decades, but certainly the pandemic circumstances have elevated and accelerated the crisis point for many organizations.
Agreed. So let's take a second and talk about human capital management. Human capital management is a philosophy. It's a way of building and engaging a workforce. So it falls under the umbrella of HR. If you go to the next slide, Jonathan. So this is a quote from LinkedIn, actually. I'm sorry, from Indeed, describing human capital management. There's a lot of different definitions of human capital management, but I want you webinar participants to think about it almost like a kind of therapy, right? You have cognitive behavioral therapy, you have dialectical behavioral therapy. They're both therapy, but they're different. It's not that one is right or wrong. They have different applications. Human capital management really emphasizes and values employees. And not to say other ways of managing don't, but they elevate it. So that slide that you're looking at right now, the employee life cycle, when we think about somebody joining a company, there's lots and lots of different steps involved. Starts off with attraction, and we'll talk a lot about that. Attraction and recruitment, pretty hand in hand, but if you're trying to optimize that, there's a lot of things you can do. Onboarding, that's a process, something that happens about how you're getting somebody into your organization going. Retention, development, separation. So there's all these stages, and typically it's hard to find organizations that do all the stages well. A lot of times they focus more on the front end and don't do as well with 4, 5, and 6, and we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, the next slide, Jonathan. So just another way to describe it to the folks on the line, think about trauma-informed care, which I'll put some stuff on the slide in a minute, or we'll do them now. Go ahead, Jonathan, you can put them all out. Human capital management, if you look at 1 through 6, like these are all things that you're doing already. It's not a novel idea to, have a compensation and benefits analysis or department or package. However, if you think about compensation and benefits as it relates to safety, try not paying one of your employees on payday or have one of their benefits not work when they try to use it. That's going to be a safety issue, I promise. All these principles, the better you use them, the more you focus on them, the bigger bang for your buck you'll have. So just as trauma-informed care can be integrated into any type of treatment, so can human capital management practices.
And I think one of the big keys, Jay, that we find in our work is that when people look at, human resource or human capital management practices and trauma-informed care practices, more often, providers are focused on integrating trauma-informed care principles and practices in their service line and participant care. But organizationally, that's where the real opportunity is to integrate these concepts and practices.
Sure. So before okay, good. It's weird presenting in different places, so bear with us, everybody. The last thing I'll say about that is there's a famous psychiatrist. His name is Bruce Perry, and he wrote some books, and you guys might be familiar with his work. But he specializes in kid trauma and treatment. And I was on the phone with him one day, and I asked him, "Hey, have you ever thought about packaging, trauma-informed business practices?" And he laughed, and his response was, "Trauma-informed care is good business practices. You don't need a separate thing to do it. If you're doing that right, it'll spill over." And so that's a good segue into this next slide, the business case. It seems like the right thing to do. It sounds great, Jay. Why should we do it? Well, there's references at the end, but you can decrease your turnover significantly through using best practices for human capital management. So, for example, you can reduce your turnover by 23% for effective onboarding. What does that look like? That's a whole nother presentation. Your wellness program, doing stay interviews. Stay interviews we'll talk a little bit more about later, but these are things that they're not new, but if you figure out how to do it right, you can have a big impact. As far as healthcare delivery costs, for every $1 an employer invests, they're going to recoup $3, be it in healthcare premium reduction or other things like lower contractual rates because the disease burden is lower on the organization, things like that. And then in terms of the revenue, I think everybody would probably agree that engaged employees have reduced absences. They show up more, right? And they're highly engaged. And one study found that organizations that are practicing effective human capital practices are 21% more profitable at their bottom line. So those costs can be derived from lots of things, including, reduced fees for recruiters or advertising and marketing money associated with recruiting, or other turnover costs, things like that. Jonathan, you have anything to add with that before we move on to our next one?
I think the only thing to really comment on is that it's really a requirement of organizational strategic planning. And our graphic on this talks about the balance of learning management, succession planning, workforce planning, and really being able to look at compensation management in these other areas as an integrated way to continuously invest in the workforce within an organization, to have it be functioning at its highest capacity and therefore highest service quality available.
So let's hear a pro tip, Jonathan.
A pro tip with that really would be honestly spending time listening to your engaged employees and looking at compassion satisfaction, not just compassion fatigue. So using things like in administrative supervision and clinical supervision, the ProQOL, the Pro Quality of Life scale, and being able to track that with employees specifically for their growth and planning within the organization to really develop the workforce.
So our transformational people practice is to create a human capital management dashboard. I've never met an organization that didn't have a balance sheet or didn't review their financials regularly. What we're suggesting, and what a lot of organizations do, is have some form of a dashboard that's operational that you can look at and see how you're doing in specific areas. For example, perhaps you want to measure your employee turnover and look at that weekly or monthly, right? Or how many days does it take from when a job posts for you to hire? Things like that.
And those are in contrast, honestly, to some of the calculations that business practices often use, which would be less in line with human capital management, such as, employee per occupied bed calculations. That may be a dashboard, but it's not a human capital management oriented dashboard that values the people in those roles. What it does is value the bottom line and the contribution to the workforce based on the balance sheet. So we want to take a moment initially from the information we've shared to try and field the question, and Pete will pull up a question from our audience as submitted.
Thanks, Jane and Jonathan. We don't currently have any Q&A, but I would put out a pitch to the attendees. Please do type those questions in as they come up, and we'll get to them in these little pauses.
So we'll move forward.
Go ahead and move forward. Thank you.
All right, so this is the bread and butter. This is why I suspect many of you attended, right? So what are the key tactics and drivers? What's the secret sauce? How do we make this work for our organization? So without further ado, let's get into it. Next slide, Jonathan. Okay, so what you're looking at here, it's a survey that was put out a couple of years ago. On the left-hand side, this is rank order from what employees said that they want from an organization. The employers were also polled, and their data was aggregated. So you have the same content on each side, they're just in a different order, right? And so what this is reflecting is, so number one, employee says, hey, I want full appreciation for work done. Well, for the employer, that wasn't number one. Employers thought that good wages was the number one from this particular survey. This survey is a couple of years old, and I wouldn't rely on it and say this is exactly what's true for my organization. There's lots of data out there across sectors, like healthcare, for example, but it's much harder to find things specific to jobs or organizations. So inpatient residential addiction treatment centers, I don't know of a national survey that reflects that. But the point of me sharing this slide with you today is, what would happen if in your organization, this is what it looked like? It would be disastrous. I highly recommend that each organization has ways, mechanisms, feedback loops of monitoring, measuring, and responding to what it is that the employees want. And I'll say is, somebody that's been a leader in large organizations, it changes frequently, super frequently. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about attraction. So engaged employees, so for substance use disorder treatment organizations, average, it does vary based on the metro area or rural type of service provided. But usually in a healthy organization, you want to see about 30% of your employees were referred from other employees. So, 70% of your folks are coming from outside the organization, from your Indeed job posting, things like that. But the other 30% were recommended or introduced or something like that. And then the other part about the public wins, it's important as organizations when you're trying to attract talent that you're sharing what's unique and special about your organization, what's good about working there, not just internally with your staff, but also externally. So for example, if my organization is like Karen, started this new excellent research institute. Well, if you tell the external world about it, but don't share the internal value with your employees, when they're asked about it in the interview, they're not going to have a favorable response most likely. So looking at the interview process and pre-boarding, this is a chance for your organization to shine. And I'll talk a little bit more later about who you're competing against, but it's corporate America. Most addiction treatment centers are small to medium-sized businesses. So your interview processes should be solid. It should be really, really smooth. And the consensus around presentation of organizational strengths, how do you talk about your organization in the interview, on the phone, when you're screening? People should have, a similar narrative, and I'm not implying something false, rather I'm implying that you come up with something that's very genuine. What is it that most people say they like about your organization, and be able to speak to that? So with respect to the promoting differentiators, right? So if you're competing against, Walmart or Capital One, they have a bigger marketing budget than you do, most likely. If you've been out and about in the world, right? You go through the drive-through, you walk into the grocery store, and you're going to see a job posting and the benefits associated with that. I don't think you could go for a day being out in the world and not be bombarded with now hiring. I mean, there's billboards along the highway, right? So in our world, I don't know that it's realistic to plan on, competing in that level. Rather, we need to talk about what's different about us. So if we're mission oriented and we're talking about saving lives, that's a little different than, giving good customer service in a food organization, right? The community investment, if I go to work in banking, I mean, sure, I might be helping people, get loans or something like that, but, helping people recover from substance use disorder, saving lives, that's a community investment that, you might not get in a lot of other areas. The career development and skill competency piece, that centers more around clinicians in particular. They want to be better. They want to be good. They're fascinated by the work. They want to do more training. And when you're trying to recruit and retain staff, it's important that they can see a little bit more about what they would get out of it. And the skills and competencies are huge, so I might learn EMDR if I join your organization, or I might learn about trauma-informed care. What is it that's happening in the organization that's setting me up to be better down the road, whether it's with the organization or not? And the final one is the team-based approach. We've seen, the shift towards virtual, and like we have folks getting out of school that are not licensed, that don't really have any, real actual experience, and they're opening private practices and doing therapy. Hopefully they're getting supervision and doing it ethically, but I can't imagine not having a team around me to do clinical consultation and supervision to learn from. But also the multidisciplinary aspect is pretty huge. It's real important to know what a psychologist actually does, and what's the difference between a psychologist and a neuropsychologist. And if you have the privilege of working with medical professionals and learning how medications are prescribed and managed, it's real hard to get that remote. these are things that you should be talking about in your interview process and advertising. Do you add anything, Jonathan?
No, I think the idea of community and culture and being really clear about the tie between mission, vision, values of the organization are the differentiators to promote within in talent attraction. Being really clear about what are those aspects and what are those benefits that aren't compensation based but value based.
Excellent.
So our transformational people practice number 3 is to secret shop your own process. Jay, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I've heard employers say, you know, people are my biggest issue. I just am not getting the, you know, the right applicant. The first thing I'd recommend that you do is secret shop your own process. Whether it's you or you have someone else do it for you, apply. Start with, hey, I want you to find the job on your own. I'm not going to send you the link. See if you can find it. Then, you know, what's the experience like completing it? If you have an application process that's ridiculous, people aren't going to do it. We're seeing a lot of people shifting towards using one-touch apply or real brief kind of screen things that people can do from their mobile phone. That's kind of the direction we're seeing things go. Once the application is submitted, how many days does it take for in some cases, the recruiter or the hiring manager to call me and screen me? And what is that process like? And then an interview probably is scheduled, right? And maybe 2, maybe 3. How many days go by between all those? There's a lot of touch points and interactions that are happening. If you think about your admissions process and how streamlined you have it in your organization, try to think about your recruiting, your screening and interviewing process is the same. You want to make it tight. Next slide. Okay. So this is my only academic thing I have, you know, research thing that I'm going to cram down your throats today. It's a 10-year-old meta-analysis by these 2 researchers. And what they did is they looked at 20 years of research around talent retention and turnover. And the reason I'm showing you the graphic is to, just like I did with that previous blue slide, to look at the factors. The order of those isn't necessarily the same today as it was at that time. But if you look at the top, compensation, right? Reward and recognition, promotion and growth opportunity. Wow, this stuff is still relevant from, you know, 10 years ago. A lot of that stuff hasn't changed. The order of operations has a little bit. So all of these factors that you're looking at are driving towards the predictor of employee retention, which is job satisfaction. How much do I like my job? And the more I like my job, the least likely I am to turn over. And let's go to the next slide. It's another way of looking at it. This is a survey from the University of Tennessee and Work Institute from 2001. So this is much more current. Again, this was a national analysis across a bunch of different industries, and it's a busy slide. So let me take a moment to explain it a little bit. So essentially, what this survey or study looked at is what are the drivers, what goes into the decision-making process when somebody leaves a job. And we're people, we're complicated, we're complex, we're not simple. It's rarely is it one reason. Usually it's a multitude of factors. So they kind of weighted these different factors as to how much importance they had when someone was making a decision like that. So if you look at the biggest one, career, 18% in the blue, essentially, so at the bottom of the slide, those are the domains and like brief descriptors as to, what they're about. But essentially, the most important thing, what impacted folks the most and weighted their decision the most, really was their career. Opportunities for growth, achievement, and security is kind of how it's described. Think about it like this: there's pleasure and mastery. I don't know many people that enter a career field and say, I just want to be average at it. We want to be good. And so that's the number one driver. Going on down the line, health and family, How many times have you known somebody to change jobs because of something related to their health of their family? Whether they're a caregiver, whether it's a medical benefit, something like that. So looking at all these different areas, the other little thing I want to point out, excuse me, is the manager. So I hope everybody's familiar with the old adage, people don't leave organizations, they leave bosses. And so if you look at the manager, I think it's like 8%, right? The manager has a ton of control and impact over a lot of these other domains, as we'll see in a minute. Might as well go ahead and shift to that slide, Jonathan. Thank you. So if you think about the manager, so here it is, 8%. Does the manager have influence over somebody's professional development, their career, helping them be the best clinician they can be? Yeah. Does the manager have influence over the work-life balance of an employee? Sure. Scheduling, job responsibilities, operational things in the workplace. Is the manager supportive and make it easy for the employee to be able to take off at a moment's notice or something like that? We're running a business. I'm not implying that people can just do whatever they want, whenever they want. One of the challenges we see with clinicians a lot is they really like telehealth, and they oftentimes prefer to be working from home rather than in person. And in some instances, that's indicated. In other instances, it's not. So the environment, the total rewards, so those speak to the work environment, like the physical plant, right? Total rewards, we're talking about compensation. So PTO, do you have a recognition program where you're, winning a gift certificate or money or something like that? And involuntary, that's terminated. So yes, you have the ability to terminate. How about the next one, Jonathan? So what you can influence. You don't have much influence as an employer over the health and family, with the exception of the medical plan. There was a construction company, I think it was in Minnesota, and they expanded their EAP services to cover every family member. And they got a bunch of notoriety for that, to see a construction industry organization recognizing the need and value to do that. Retirement piece, the drivers of that more about spending habits. Sure, you can have a great retirement plan, but that's referring more to how quickly someone can retire. And then the relocation piece, right? People are going to move for whatever reason. So come back to this slide if you're looking to come up with a plan and really focus on that left-hand column. Jonathan, next slide. All right, so here's the meat. This is why a lot of you are here today. Let's jump into some of the key tactics of attraction. So this was a Gallup poll from earlier this year. Again, not industry specific, but generally speaking across industries, this is what's most important to people when they're going to work at a new employer or new job. Those shouldn't be surprising to you. Next half, Jonathan. So this is specific to substance use disorder treatment and your organization, most likely. What you're going to need to do to be able to attract employees, yes, you should factor in everything on the left, but you really should be talking to, doing exit interviews, talking to people when you're hiring them, asking them what made them, make the decision to join you. The intentional outreach is huge. We're not really seeing that in a lot of other industries, a couple, accepted, but at McDonald's, they don't personally come to my table and say, hey, you want a job? And the way you're going to get some of your best employees is putting yourself in positions where you're going to actually meet these people where you normally might not. We can't sit back anymore and hope we get lucky. with candidates showing up. Culture expressed in the interview, I'll talk a little bit about that more in the case study time. We talked about differentiating factors. Got to let people know why working for you is better than another organization or another industry. Personalized outreach, what I'll say about that. So I asked my dentist, I'm always asking, wherever I go, I'm asking people about their workforce issues. I asked my dentist about a hire he made, he was real happy about. And he said what he does is he personally, it was a dental assistant, right? He personally outreached the candidates and invited them in, and that made like a big difference for him. So you'll have to get personal. I need to speed up a little bit. Next slide, Jonathan. So retention, left-hand side. So if you go to the NAATP website or you go to the C4 website and the Human Capital website, I have an article I wrote earlier this year on addiction counselor turnover. So there's a bunch of great info in it. That's kind of a summary of the organizational factors that are going to influence addiction counselor treatment turnover. Next half, Jonathan. So our recommendations, employee satisfaction, I hope you're doing a pulse survey or measuring and tracking that somehow and doing something with it. Career growth, something that you're investing in. Employees should be able to say, when I work at organization X, I'm getting X, Y, and Z. Compensation, that's assuming your compensation is at market. You can't be too low. You got to have good enough compensation. You're not going to be able to come up with these crazy packages that are going to match Google, but that's a necessary thing. You might need to do a market analysis. Work-life balance, we talked about that a little. The last one I'll say is just the mission integrity piece. Working at your organization, does that really matter? Am I really having a change? Are we really helping people? Are people getting sober? Are people living better lives? It's important that folks are able to speak to that and not feel like they're a cog in the wheel. So let me stop there. Pete, let me give it to you. What are folks in the chat questions? We're hoping to have a little bit of a dialogue.
Yeah, we do have one question related to HR departments. Are HR departments and organizations understaffed? Are they undertrained? Which is typically the bigger problem in most organizations from your perspective?
It's a great question. So I think HR professionals have gotten the rawest end of the deal throughout the pandemic. Because they're the ones that are being looked at and judged and saying, why can't you come up with a better strategy or get the right people like it's their fault? Understaffing, I wouldn't say any more than other organizations. I'd encourage every organization to go do some benchmarking around how many HR FTEs they should have per regular FTEs. I'm a member of the Society of Human Resource Management, and they have data on that nationally. And their recommendation for medium-sized employers, so we're looking at employers, like 100, is 1 FTE of an HR professional per 25. So it'd be 4 HR professionals for an organization of 100. Very rarely do we come across organizations that are staffed like that. But the business case, makes complete sense when you look at turnover, and that's a different discussion for another day. So no, I don't think it's a human resource issue. Another way to put it, I've had organizations say, if only I got the best employee, everything will be fine. I didn't say this, but what I thought was, well, if you got the best employee, you probably won't be able to keep them because your problem isn't attraction, it's retention. So really knowing what is your issue. Is it retraction, is it retention? Rural areas have a attraction problem. Urban areas have a retention problem. It's real important to know the difference and intervene accordingly.
I do think it is there is a piece for some smaller growing organizations when a smaller treatment providing organization dual roles someone in an HR capacity. Often in smaller organizations, it is a challenge of not so much understaffed, but not being able to have adequate HR support that really understands the workforce they're serving. So I certainly want to acknowledge and recognize the challenge of that in the workforce. And I think the more organizations learn human capital management best practices and are able to integrate them into their human resource operations, the more safety mitigation can occur on understaffing and undertraining.
That's a great question.
Thank you so much.
Jonathan, that kind of leads into a follow-up question, which is how can organizations instill the importance of some of these principles and HR mindset outside of the HR department and separate that segregation?
I think that the primary pivot point really comes into integrating the type of supervision at every level of the organization of administrative and or clinical oversight supervision, that really making HR a valued support in the administrative supervision process as opposed to this thing that happens separately. Often organizations, especially when they grow larger, human resource or human capital management becomes its own silo that isn't integrated in the process. And as a result, that lack of integration produces miscommunication about benefit access and benefit opportunity and the value of employee retention, being able to say that human resources is there to help support the workforce within the organization. So one of the key opportunities is really that administrative and clinical supervision really being integrated. And again, we'll talk about it in a case study of an example of doing that in a small to mid-sized organization. So I think being able to have everyone understand not just what their benefits are when they go through that pre-boarding and onboarding process, but being able to measure HR relationships as part of your dashboard ongoing in an organization is a really key factor to change that.
The only thing I'd add is this webinar is recorded and will be shared. Share this webinar with people in your organization that might be interested. This is what we do. We exist to help organizations down this path. But one of the challenges organizations have is they're reluctant at times to ask for help, and we'd love to help with that. Let's jump into some case studies, Jonathan, shall we?
Absolutely. So our first case study discussion was an organization that our consultancy served during what we call the course correction. The organization had been around for several years, Midwest full continuum of care for addiction treatment. So being able to have detox residential, partial care, and intensive outpatient along with supportive living. And during a transition of leadership, the organization had determined that it needed to take the time selectively, so engaged us to help support their search for a different type of candidate, and in the process also look at the growth of culture. They were an organization that experienced incredible success and rapid growth, and as a result, the opportunity to look at the culture really changed in that growth period. One of the things that was engaged was really initially looking at the retention and recruitment strategy, both from the new executive leadership role, but also within the organization. So really being able to take our time to understand what were the growth pains and the growth successes the organization experienced, and also what was that ideal candidate. So what we ultimately came up with was an assessment process leading to a candidate profile. So rather than just having a job description and saying, this is who we're looking for, in this executive leadership role, it was taking the time to understand what did the organization need in this particular position. And granted, it was the executive director. Through our process, it was really intentional and collaborative approach to the new leadership role. So really engaging the young leadership team of a young growing organization and asking them what do they need in their individual and team support processes within the leadership team and then their individual departments. We implemented course correction within human capital management processes by looking at policy and procedure revision. So being able to look at what were the policies that really needed updating and what were the procedures that weren't really effective for the organization to produce the culture they wanted to experience. We proceeded in implementation of administrative and clinical supervision, as I've been speaking throughout. We looked at the process to say, who are performing these functions, and not just on the rote policy and procedure, but how are people experiencing administrative and clinical supervision? There was an effort to build in the QOL, the professional quality of life scale, with the clinical director who had been doing a long-term study and their doctoral work on the impacts of using the ProQOL as one measure and really looked at the compassion satisfaction scores towards understanding how do we increase retention in the organization. We took time to clarify job descriptions and roles, and as identified often in smaller growing organizations, people wear many hats. And it had become confusing for some of even the leadership to understand who did they report to and what was under their domain, effectively creating challenges for the culture in employee retention. So we took the time to really accurately and precisely look at what were real job descriptions and role clarification, and began to use tools such as a RACI process for decision-making within teams to be able to really have the kind of transparent communication that could be relied upon in producing safety in the organization. Lastly, we looked at compensation adjustments and corrections that had formerly been handled within a very small, unclear, and unbalanced way in the organization, and looked to make achievable, sustainable growth plans with leadership in the organization and their teams through compensation analysis, through growth opportunity, and looking at compensation packages that made sense for specific individuals in the organization based on their growth goals and their growth needs within the organization. And ultimately, what we were able to identify over a course of a 9-month period in recruiting a new leader into the role and onboarding them in a very deliberate process that empowered the leadership teams to be able to have a voice in the decision, was that the employee retention grew 11% within a period of 9 months. There were several people in the organization during the transition of new leadership that were concerned about a change of leadership at this stage, but ultimately, this is 2.5 years later, through the pandemic with this experience, that their overall employee recruitment and retention had increased to 17% sustainably during one of the most challenging times the organization had experienced. The transparent organizational feedback loop that was created in this process is something that the new leadership and executive direction had brought with him with a tremendous amount of experience, and has been able to maintain continuous feedback loop of the human capital management index that they use in their KPI leadership, of being able to really communicate how things are happening in decision-making throughout the organization, but most importantly, being able to be really clear about the feedback loop on a quarterly basis with the employment group of how things were changing and what the successes of the impacts that the changes they were making are sustaining. And so they really created a very simple way of more than just a town hall, but really communicating consistently in team meetings what the impacts of the overall movement in human capital management were producing for the organization.
Feedback loop is so important. So I recently did some work with an organization that's located in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. So it's a rural organization. And one of the things that the reason we started working together is we really wanted to take a good look at attracting employees to support the organizational growth. There's someone put a question in the comments that I appreciate, something to the effect of job description creation and some logistics around that. That was the first thing we did, was look at our job description. That's so important. It's one of the first things that people see. But further on down the line with the employee kind of life cycle, assuming your job descriptions are good and your screening process is good and you have good interviews, we wanted to look at the interview process and how we could optimize that. So you might be familiar with, if you've ever been on an interview panel, oftentimes at the end of the interview, the candidate will ask, what do you like about the organization? And typically what happens is people will go around the room and everyone answers the question and they all say something different. And what I suggested and what the literature suggests is that you're able to have responses that are concise and clear. Have your team reflect upon what do they like about the organization. And when they're able to speak to it and they're saying similar things, that's a lot different than having a whole bunch of disjointed, confusing information in the interview process. And it's also more genuine. So highly recommend doing that. And the transparent communication and collaboration piece, that's organizational. It's to reflect upon the strengths of the organization just for the purposes of an interview. is really short-sighted, right? That could be something that you could benefit across the whole entire organization. You know, what if you had some kind of exercise or initiative or whatever, where the whole organization reflected on what it is that they like about, you know, your particular organization. So that's just a brief example. We're running out of time. We got about 10 more minutes. Jonathan, we have another case study, and I see some questions popping up. Let me give it to you for the last case study, and then we can hopefully address some questions before we run out of time.
Absolutely, and thank you, Jay. So our last case study involved a large historic program within a large hospital system. So we were engaged to provide a program assessment for strategic growth and looking at systemic integration of how to take this very unique behavioral health organization into a larger hospital system that had taken new ownership and was applying a variety of cultural improvements and human capital management practices. Our recommendations included some program changes and service line growth, which were challenging for the organization to receive, but ultimately gave a pathway for the leadership of the organization to continue to grow success. One of the key drivers in our process and recommendations was looking at the integration of the larger systems human capital management practices in the recruitment and retention. The recruitment and retention efforts at the time of the assessment were showing that an average of a 6 to 9 month employee turnover rate when we began the recommendation process. Part of the organizational change led to a leadership transition and a growth of organizational change in the leadership team, bringing in a new executive director and several of the leadership management team. This team then set out on a cultural healing and transformation process of integrating both the larger strategic changes and, most importantly, the human capital management practices, really trying to understand who was the best person for the right role, rather than just trying to fill a seat to be able to produce the service, to look at ultimately how was the recruiting process and what were the internal recruiting processes within this very large hospital system available to support this organization's growth. Being able to look at this fast growth and slow change process is something that, in picking this case study, Jay and I talked about. And what this team experienced was being able to look at the opportunity for making rapid decision-making and growth and being able to adjust their strategic and tactical plans, but investing in a slow, intentional change process to rebuild the culture of the organization. The cultural transformation process really overhauled and improved their recruitment and retention. And over the time of if I remember correctly, Jay, about a 2-year period, they were able to increase their overall retention rates by 15%.
Yeah, sounds right.
So the process for them was really looking at both when they're making growth and expansion change, how are they sharing information? What were the resources that they weren't tapping into in the larger system? And how could the mission and passion of this organization that was so incredibly dedicated to their service be able to then apply that internally to each other in the organization and in the cultural transformation? And what ultimately came to practice was an organization so highly dedicated to trauma-informed care and their participant care had lacked investment systemically over trauma-informed care at the organizational level within their culture. And they identified some very specific changes of being able to have a cultural attunement process that reflected the attachment style of their service into the attachment style of their leadership and organizational process.
Let's look at our key takeaways, Jonathan, so we can get some questions in. Essentially, you know, human capital management framework, you got to adopt it. There's no reason not to. Attracting talent, you're going to have to use a different approach. And there's a question that we'll get to in a minute that's related to that. You got to keep who you have. How are you investing differently in your workforce? Every organization has some new benefit. We have pet insurance now, and our dental plan is a little better, and PTO structured differently. That's the expectation. You have to do that to be competitive. What's different? And then the last thing I'd say, modeling the mission you're a mission-driven organization, most likely, right? And the reason you do what you do is because you and your team really care about recovery and want to see that happen for people. Make sure that you're communicating that message internally just as much as you are externally.
And in that last portion, really being able to look at, often in larger business organizations, they look at the internal branding and the internal messaging. And, you know, for us as providers, often people will say they love the culture of where we work, but when we talk to leadership, they say, boy, we're having an incredible time trying to recruit people. And those two pieces really aren't in alignment. And so it's then taking the time to explore and look at where's the disconnect between that experience that employees are having and the transition of the recruitment and retention efforts.
So let's open it up to questions. We only have a couple minutes. I want to respond to a question in the chat that was posted, essentially saying, hey, I'm a clinician, you know, I've been doing it for a long time, and they're hiring new clinicians without licenses, and they're making just as much money as me. So you have to do pay adjustments in organizations. You have to do what's called a compensation analysis. You can do it internally, or, you know, we could help you with that process. Yeah, that makes people resentful. It's great if you want to, you know, hire a therapist at $5,000 more than you used to, but you have to start with who you have first. You do the internal adjustments before you reflect the external new hires. It's a great way to lose people if that doesn't happen. Another question.
You mentioned this question as you were talking, Jay. Is there a process for new job description creation that is recommended? Would you recommend looking at current staff and engaging current staff in the process, and or use an outside organization to help create or review?
It depends on the organization. If you go to Karen's website and look at their job descriptions, they almost cut and paste verbatim job descriptions from the Society of Human Resource Management. And there's a lot of really good reasons to do that. Downside is, are you really going to attract the candidates you want with some boring, generic job description? So the answer is it depends. But yes, you're asking the right question. You do got to put the time and energy into figuring out how to answer that from your organization.
And I would say that it's both and, right? That in our case study example, in the first case study, that taking the time to ask people to really reflect on their tasks and what are they doing day to day, moment to moment in their service in the organization, helped clarify and build collaboration and empowerment, and being able to write and revise those job descriptions so that they were more accurate and more precisely being able to be measured and tracked for things like performance evaluations, for things like, you know, looking at compassion satisfaction. And I do think that it's definitely worth the investment to look at outside organizations, as Jay's referenced several times. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, has amazing resources to be able to provide that, but also within the field of behavioral health, to be able to have people who understand the nature of the work and the impact of how those job descriptions are written. I think one of the challenges is to write the description for the system and not the individual, not a person, but a function, and to balance the humanity in that process is really the key opportunity for people to have engagement and to show their value and to be able to be valued appropriately in a sustainable way.
Brene Brown said to be clear is kind, but she's not a lawyer. And there's a lot of legal things associated with job descriptions. So you can't just give clinicians a pad of paper and have them come up with this beautiful job description. Job descriptions serve a couple different purposes, right? And as an organizational leader, you have to consider all of them. And you have got like 30 seconds, 10 seconds. I don't know how much time we have left.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more, which is a follow-up to the piece on new clinicians. It says the situation a lot of us find ourselves in now is that we can go work a 9-to-5 job with significantly less stress and responsibility in an office or retail environment with no educational or license requirements for the same pay or slightly less. And this is an issue that we've been hearing a lot at NAATP from our members is there is a greater competition with corporate America in these lower stress, maybe lower prestige jobs that have the same pay with much less burnout potential or emotional trauma and those kinds of things. And how do you combat that?
Sure. Jonathan, why don't you answer that? I feel like I hit it on a couple slides.
Yeah, I think looking at it and being able to understand that intentional outreach was one of the sources of being able to look at understanding, recruiting, people who understand the mission and the value of the work that they're doing, and being able to look at the stress management side of things. So being able to say, not just how do we reduce compassion fatigue, which again, part of it is human capital management, of being able to make sure that employees really do understand the value of the benefits that they have and to use that. I think being able to be really clear and diversify your recruitment sources is part of that challenge. Very clearly being able to build relationships in your local community with a multiple set of sources that are attracting the people that both understand compensation and growth, but understand also the clarity of the value of the work that they're doing and the impact in the bigger picture when it comes to mission. I don't think it's a simple process to manage, but I think as organizations understand who's the best fit for their organization, that diversifying those sources can become clearer and being more intentional.
Your comp has to be good enough, right? It doesn't need to be the best. It's got to be good enough. So that absolutely is part of the solution.
Jay, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking time to present with us today. We are out of time. Just real quick, closing out, we will be sending a follow-up email next week with confirmation of CE credit, a link to the recording from the session, and a PDF of the slides. We'll include a link to the blog that Jay mentioned, talking about counselor burnout and retention, and a link to that Karen research study. Thank you, Jonathan, Jay. This has been great. Thanks everybody for attending. And with that, we'll close.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Good luck.